Welcome everyone. We are going to have a very practical and useful episode about running injuries, how to run injury-free and how to overcome running injuries. And we have a brilliant guest. He has master's degree in physiotherapy practice. He is the founder and CEO of the Run Smarter series, and he hosts the awesome Run Smarter podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest, Mr. Brodie Sharpe. Welcome, Brodie.
Thanks for having me on, Ollie. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, brilliant to have you. So you have been as a guest in quite many podcasts and you have your own podcast. So let's not talk too much about your background as it's in the other episodes. So you have done over 200 podcast episodes on running injuries. What are the most surprising things or the things you want to highlight from the interviews and your episodes?
Yeah, well, the aim of all of my content is just to educate health professionals, but mainly runners, on how to reduce their risk of injuries. It's just crazy how prevalent and how common running-related injuries are. And so trying to communicate exactly why runners get injured and exactly what they can do to reduce their risk of injuries is where I naturally hone a lot of my content, and as well as busting a few myths, because there are plenty of misconceptions out there when it comes to running, when it comes to the perfect warm-up, when it comes to whether you should be strength training or not, or stretching, or if you do have an injury, should you run, rest, ice, heat, tape, all these sort of things that come out of the woodworks. And a lot of it is quite confusing. A lot of it is contradictory. And for a runner, as well as health professionals, to try and decipher what's evidence-based or what's effective, what's not effective can be quite tricky. And so the aim of my podcast is trying to decipher all of that and trying to pick out, okay, what should you be paying attention to, because this is evidence-based, or what has been proven to be unhelpful but is still in the regular community, like being widespread information. And so, yeah, that's usually my attempts. And when I ask my listeners what they're mainly after, a lot of recreational runners are just wanting to reduce their risk of injury as much as possible. That's the number one thing they want. It's injury prevention, because they're either terrified of getting an injury and having to lose their fitness or have these setbacks preparing for their marathon race, or they've had a horrific injury in the past and really struggled to negotiate that injury, and they've really struggled to find that effective treatment. So they just want to reduce their injuries as much as possible.
Yeah, I think it really makes sense that what you're doing, and I think it's great episodes you are having. So in a nutshell, what would you say are the secrets of running injury-free? It's a wide question. You have done like 200 episodes, but we have like few minutes here. What would be the
All right.
main points?
I would start off by saying it's unrealistic to implement something and expect to be injury-free. I have a realistic expectation that if you train smart, that's why I've got the Run Smarter podcast. If you make these smart decisions, it can significantly reduce your risk of injury, but we can't get that risk down to zero. I think what causes injuries are so multifactorial. There's just so many things at play, and you need to be really strong when it comes to running, and the accumulation of load is just enormous. So any little fluctuation in training might increase your risk of injury. So I usually start off by saying that we can do all these things to reduce your risk, but we can't get that risk down to zero. But if symptoms do arise and you do start developing early signs of an injury, it's knowing exactly what to do, like day 1, day 2, day 3, to negotiate those symptoms really quickly without losing fitness, and then you're back on track. But for those who want to start implementing something that would have the biggest bang for their buck, being the most efficient way of reducing their risk of injury, in a nutshell, you want to avoid abrupt shifts in training, because this is sort of what I keep going back to on the podcast. The number one reason why runners get injured is because they have had a training error, an abrupt change that the body just wasn't used to. It's exceeded the body's ability or capacity to adapt. And that comes in with large fluctuations or large changes in load. So that could be doing increasing the amount of mileage too quickly, running too fast too quickly, changing their terrain, so going from flats to hills, changing their footwear, going from like supportive shoes to something more minimalist. And all of these shifts are okay as long as it's gradual enough that the body can adapt and catch up. And so that's the nutshell from the external load sort of approach. And that's the bulk of the running related injuries. It's not about like the running techniques, or it's not about, you know, what type of shoe you need to be. You don't necessarily need to blame the shoes or blame how flexible you are. Most of it will usually come down to this external abrupt shift in training that just exceeds the body's capacity to adapt. So instead of adapting, it just is too much of a shock to the system, and so it starts breaking down rather than building up.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe we take a step backwards. What would you say is a running injury? Like, you always have some sensation. Sometimes it's just something, and sometimes it's a pain, and sometimes it's something that prevents you really doing things. What would you say is an injury?
I follow a lot of the running research that gets published, and they define injuries. Most of them define them differently, but there's a general consensus, and it's kind of the amount of time spent off running or the amount of times they've had to alter their running due to a certain pain. So following the science, they usually pick something that's symptom provoking, that has, say, 7 to 10 days off running, or 7 to 10 days of altered running, like you're having those symptoms dictate what your training volume is. It might be backing off your mileage, or it might be only doing slow paces. But I do agree, runners do get niggles all over, especially if they're heavy into marathon training, or if they're an ultra runner. They'll constantly have niggles or symptoms pop up here and there, but most of those innocent, non-injury style symptoms just negotiate themselves really easily. It's like a day or two that it lasts for, and then it just goes away. Whereas an injury would be a little bit more disruptive. It'd take a lot longer. And if you have those particular symptoms that persist beyond 7 to 10 days, it's definitely an injury. It's not a niggle that you can just train without any modifications and expect to get better.
So you have some sensation. How should you do with the new sensation? So, for example, you start to feel something in your knee, you start to feel something in your foot. How do you go from there? How do you define what should be done next?
I think making sure that you identify if there is any shifts in your training. So it would be nice to recognize as soon as symptoms develop, okay, what have I done in the last week that might be an explanation for that? Because a lot of times we want to learn from our mistakes. And if there is a mistake somewhere in the last 7 days, we want to learn from that and change what we do moving forward. But if symptoms do arise, I often talk about a adaptation zone. And I explain this to my runners on the podcast. Every single tendon, muscle, ligament in your body has a certain adaptation zone that you want to train within so that it gets stronger. But if you exceed that adaptation zone, that's when symptoms start arising and, you know, an injury starts developing. That's why I was talking about those abrupt shifts in training. But when symptoms arise, and if you notice it day one or during a run and it gets a little bit irritated, it's important to know that adaptation zone, if it's irritated and it's a bit sore, that adaptation zone diminishes, it drops, it sets a new baseline for just specifically for that area. So for example, if someone runs and they do a little bit too much and they start developing like knee pain, and all of a sudden the next day it's a little bit sore to walk, it's a little bit sore to do stairs or squats, running's okay, but still sparks a little bit of symptoms. Keep in mind that adaptation zone has now diminished just for that particular structure. And our aim is to try and train within that new adaptation zone. So that might be backing off your loading a little bit. It might be stopping running for 2 days. It might be just starting or backing off your strength training and modifying that to do some sort of variation of your strength training. But keep in mind, I don't say complete rest. We need to modify your current load, whether that be running, strength training, cross training, so that it still fosters strength within that adaptation zone, so that it builds itself back up rather than stays in that sensitized, kind of weakened state.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. So I have experienced maybe three decades of sports, so I know quite well what kind of pain is something that you need to take more seriously than others. But for example, now I have had some aching in my left quadriceps, and I have never had it before. And first it was just a sensation, like not really a pain. I just felt that I felt my left quadriceps. I paid attention to it. And now it's been maybe a month. And I think yesterday it was maybe the first time that I felt it also during the training. Nothing bad, just kind of aching, a little bit like something. So what would you say? How should I approach? I'm thinking that because I don't even know where it comes, so I don't know what to avoid. So how would you approach this kind of situation?
And probably most of the guidelines that I'm following, or most of the advice I'm giving out, I should say, is for, say, running related injuries or overuse injuries. It wouldn't be direct trauma or some sort of say like a ligament injury where someone's been tackled or someone's like twisted on something or popped something. Like we're talking about mainly just overuse injuries.
Yeah.
If your quadricep muscle is slowly getting worse, it's slowly creeping into more of your activities, it's sort of slowly exceeding your current capacity. It's slowly exceeding your current adaptation zone. And if that continues, what happens is the quadricep becomes more irritated and less able to tolerate what it could previously do. And so obviously a diagnosis would be best, because it could be referral from the back, or it could be, some other neurological thing. But assuming that it's an overloaded musculotendinous sort of injury, we can kind of follow these guidelines. And I would make sure that if things are carrying over into your daily activities, or all of a sudden stairs are sore, all of a sudden your running is sore, which it wasn't previously, you'd really want to catch that as early as possible, because you don't want this sort of carryover effect or this trajectory that you're currently on to get worse and worse and worse. And so you would ask yourself, okay, where's my current adaptation zone? Where does it lie? And what am I doing to be proactive enough to bridge the gap between where my current capacity and current strength is and where my goals lie? And so it might be a lot of my runners are just wanting to return to running pain-free, or they want to return to a triathlon or a 10K race. And so it's like, okay, where's the current capacity? Let's maybe do some hopping on the spot. Let's maybe do some squats. Let's maybe do some box jumps. Let's maybe run for 5K at a certain speed. And let's pay attention to symptoms. Let's pay attention to symptoms during the exercise. Let's pay attention to symptoms afterwards to see if there's any hangover effect of symptoms carrying over into the next day. And let's establish like how strong it is. And once we establish where that adaptation zone is, we can then build upon that adaptation zone and try and bridge that gap between where it currently is and where you want to be. So it might be building it up with some squats or some lunges, or it might be modifying your running by avoiding hills, or backing off on the speed a little bit. It might be increasing your running cadence. It might just be making sure that you're warmed up before an exercise. All these little modifications that you can do to restore and build up the current capacity, so that we're bridging the gap between what is now sort of becoming quite irritated and where your current capacity lies.
And you said about assessing the pain. Could you quickly explain the scale from 1 to 10, how to assess the pain, that you can then actually track what is the situation?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because everyone interprets pain differently and everyone perceives pain differently. I do try my best to put it in sort of qualitative matters. And I do have an episode on this, because a lot of my runners when I talk to them about having an injury, I give them some pain guidelines around what's acceptable, what's not acceptable during a run. And for most running related injuries, anything below a 4 out of 10 is acceptable, like during a run, provided that it doesn't exacerbate symptoms after that activity and it doesn't carry over into the next day. So I say pain for most running related injuries, pain below a 4 out of 10 during the activity that doesn't exacerbate after the exercise, that returns to baseline symptoms within 24 hours is acceptable. And so I usually deal within the 0, 1, 2, and 3 and try and describe what that actually might feel like so that people can analyze it themselves and say, actually, this is acceptable or this is unacceptable. And the 2 or 3 out of 10 pain, I usually describe as something that you notice it there. Let's say for a runner, if they have knee pain, when they run, they can kind of notice it there. It's enough to be a constant reminder. However, it's not severe enough for them to feel apprehension around planting that foot and taking off with that foot. So if you're going, say, downhill, paying attention to how confident you are planting that foot on the ground and not like being really ginger with landing. But when it comes to pushing off, paying attention to the unaffected side and seeing how confident you are pushing off with that side and making sure it's similar on the opposite side. So you're not overly cautious, not overly apprehensive. We're not changing your running form at all, which is a big no-no. If you're modifying your running in any way or you're limping, even just a mild limp in any particular way, symptoms are too aggressive or too high for you to be running within those acceptable pain limits. So a 1 can kind of be symptoms very, very light that comes and goes. It's only kind of when you think about it or only when you sort of push the limits a little bit that you can start to notice it. The 2 or 3 are a little bit more of a constant reminder, but still not severe enough, or you still have the confidence to plant that foot and push off that leg equal to the opposite side.
Yeah, so you said that if you need to limp, that's over, and then the others you should be tracking. And how would you do the tracking? Do you suggest to use some app? Do you just suggest to put them on the calendar, or what would be the practical way to actually do this and follow up?
I don't think there's any right or wrong, provided that you're using the right timeframes and you're writing it down somewhere. You can't go off memory because everyone's memory is shocking. If you try and look back 4 days ago, what the pain was like during the run, after the run the next day, people have a really inaccurate recollection of what happened. So as long as you're writing it down, and I always say, okay, remember what happened during that exercise, remember what happened like during that cool down later on the day, what those symptoms like, and always the next day, particularly the next morning, especially for like tendon injuries. We want to make sure that the first steps in the morning, walking around for the first hour or so, want to make sure there's no spikes in symptoms there, because a lot of times when runners have a tendinopathy, let's say it's an Achilles tendinopathy, and they start running, it's a bit sore, but then they have that warm-up effect. So pain subsides as they warm up, almost sometimes to the point of being completely pain-free, and they can complete a 10K run absolutely pain-free. It's not until the next morning that they're really paying for it, but then they warm up again and they're pain-free and they go for that run again. And it kind of gives them the green light of saying, running's fine, running symptoms are okay, so maybe running is fine. And it's only until we explain those 3 timeframes and making sure that those 3 timeframes are acceptable to start to interpret whether what you're doing is acceptable. And so I do recommend people write it down. I work with runners online all the time, and I just use a pretty standard Google spreadsheet to say Monday to Sunday, these are the runs that you're going to do. These are the rehab exercises that you're going to do. And what they do is comment on the cell. They leave a little comment per day to just highlight, these are my symptoms, these are the changes in training, or these are the changes in symptoms, just so we can accurately kind of identify a trend, whether our rehab is working week by week or day by day, whether what you're doing has been successful or not.
Yeah, and what would you say is kind of a normal trajectory? Of course, there's no normal, but some sort of average. Like, how does the pain go? If you have, for example, pain of 4 when you start with your plantar fasciitis and you reduce the load a bit and you track it, how does it normally go during the run, the pain, and in the morning, for example? What would be, how long does it take that you start to see effects?
Every runner is completely different, which is it's really tough to answer, which I think you're expecting that anyway. But I would say general guidelines, the longer you've had the injury for, the harder it is to get better. I think a 2-week Achilles tendinopathy is going to be way different than a 2-month Achilles tendinopathy. And I have sometimes some 2-year Achilles tendinopathies. It's very slow and gradual the longer you've had it for. And so those expectations should be laid out. The research will show for a chronic tendinopathy, somewhere in the ballpark of 6 to 12 months, but sometimes longer than 12 months. That's for a tendinopathy that's been going on for a few years. However, that is 6 to 12 months from good management. You could mismanage a tendon for years and just not get better because you've been mismanaged it for so long. It's 6 to 12 months once really good management starts that we should start seeing carryover. But even then, in a really chronic tendon, I see chronic tendons all the time. I specialize in proximal hamstring tendinopathy. It's 70% of my caseload currently. And it can be a very gradual week by week, sometimes a very gradual 2 weeks by 2 weeks, seeing a trend of improvements. And other times it's a little bit more, profound. It can be a little bit more instantaneous. Sometimes someone mismanages or misidentifies their irritant, and it's not until you just remove that and follow up with really good management that all of a sudden they feel a lot better, a lot quicker. And so depends on the injury. If it's a stress fracture, a lot harder to manage or a lot longer. You need to be a lot more patient. If it's, say, patellofemoral pain, people can overcome that quite quickly with some really good management skills. Shin splints, it can be a little bit more stubborn. I've found that shin splints can be a little bit more on the stubborn side. But like we've said before, everyone interprets pain differently as well. So everyone responds differently once you start that management plan. So it's really, really hard to predict.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of managing expectation, that we might be talking about years. And then many people think that, all right, I need to rest a year or something. How would you say to this, that about resting and then noticing, testing it every month and no, it's not good yet?
Very good to point out, because I do have this concept I refer to often on my podcast. This pain, rest, weakness, downward spiral is what I call it. And if you had an injury, if you had a abrupt shift in training and all of a sudden your Achilles has flared up because of that abrupt change, like we mentioned at the start, your adaptation zone in this really sensitized state has now diminished. So it can no longer tolerate the loads that it once had. So in other words, it's temporarily weaker while it's in this sensitized state. It's very important that we try and find that new adaptation zone and train within that adaptation zone to build it back up. But what most recreational runners do is they say, damn, I'm injured, I've overdone myself, let me have 7 days off, let me settle down the symptoms, and let me see how I go after 7 days. Let me just see if I'm ready to get back. And so they combat this weakened state with rest, which contributes to further weakness. So then they return to running that next weekend, and they return at the same dosage or the same mileage speed that they had previous to the injury. And it flares things up again because it's an obvious abrupt excess of load. And so it flares up again. It becomes more irritated than it once did. And so a runner's natural inkling is to say, all right, maybe it's just not healed yet. Maybe I just need more time off because 7 days wasn't enough. So then they take a further 2 weeks off, and contributes to further weakness, which then if you start hiking or if you start cycling or if you start some sort of strength training, sometimes that can be enough to trigger the pain because it's so weak and sensitized, and therefore contributes to further pain, rest, weakness is why I call the pain, rest, weakness downward spiral, because let's say plantar fasciitis is a very, very common condition that I see that follows this pain, rest, weakness downward spiral to the point where people are unable to walk in bare feet, or they're unable to spend 45 minutes doing grocery shopping because their fascia is flared up. And then that's when they put themselves in really supportive shoes and orthotics and encase their foot in the most support possible for pain relief. But then that further contributes to weakness because the foot isn't working. And so that's that takes the cake, I think, in terms of conditions that elicit this pain, rest, weakness, downward spiral. But a lot of overuse injuries, a lot of these running related injuries can follow the same pattern.
Yeah, I think that's really, really, you're on the point. I think I have specialized myself with different injuries that I have had them for years. Like I have had Osgood-Schlatter's disease in my knees when I was doing triple jump as a teenager. I think that carried on like maybe 10, 15 years on some level. I have had jumper's knee, plantar fasciitis, many other things, but I have never missed a game or a training, or I don't usually need to limp. I've been able to keep it just there, basically training for decades every day, and still having some of those issues. How would you say, me looking backwards, should I have done it differently? Basically, I've been able to perform, but tracking those along sometimes couple of years each injury.
I would say you have probably started operating on like baseline, like things have returned to baseline, not getting better, not getting worse, but you've elicited enough exposure to that injury so that it doesn't get worse. It's not like a particular flare up, but baseline would just hover at this like acceptable pain, which takes me back to these acceptable pain rules. Yes, it needs to be less than a 4 out of 10 in most cases. Yes, it needs to return to baseline within 24 hours. But another guideline on top of that is it should be getting better week by week. Because if it's not getting better week by week, then it's going to be very hard to overcome it when you finally decide enough is enough. Let me try and bite the bullet and really overcome it. But you've had it for 2 years. That's going to be so hard to overcome. So looking back on it, I'd probably suggest that, yes, you could have kept operating at that same athletic level, but probably should have supplemented something else in to rehab it a little bit more effectively so that you could see an improvement week by week. And that might have been more honed in strength training or just trying to implement something to raise up the capacity or raise up the adaptation zone of that injured site. And so that would probably be my advice. If you had to look back, it'd probably be more focusing on the rehab side of things. But again, complete rest wouldn't be the answer, which is what you didn't do.
Yeah, and at that point there was no podcast yet invented, so I couldn't listen to your podcast. For example, I had a jumper's knee, and I was reading the scientific articles, and it was basically, the guideline was to do eccentric squats like quite often. I think it was even twice a day, a few sets, and basically I would be doing it 3 months, and then I made one mistake, one jump where the load was too big and it kind of went to the baseline. And I think that was really, really frustrating, that it felt that it didn't really help if you made one jump. How would you say the tendency of different injuries, like what are the, for example, if you compare jumper's knee to plantar fasciitis, is there some differences how they behave? Have you noticed some kind of things that you could highlight for people?
Yeah, there's been a ton of research around tendinopathies and what the best approach is for those. It first came out that eccentric loading was fantastic for tendons. They get this, for most cases, they have this analgesic response where they feel symptoms subside and they feel like power return, strength return in most cases, and that can be immediate. They could notice improvement in pain within one session or like within a couple of minutes as soon as they've found out that tendons love slow, heavy load. And that's particularly one approach that I like to take. The research is still up in the air in terms of what the most effective approach is for slow, heavy stuff, because it first came out that eccentric loading was the approach that needs to be taken. But then some other competing researchers come out to say, you know what, concentric or sometimes the concentric eccentric combination can be just as effective. And so it's hard to really find one answer for that, but it doesn't really matter because like they respond equally as well to whatever approach. So as long as it's slow, heavy, controlled load that's within your adaptation zone that doesn't increase symptoms within 24 hours and doesn't spark a huge flare up, that can be really, really nice for tendons. So Achilles issues, sometimes plantar fasciitis can behave as a tendon, even though it's just fascia. It can still have that same response. High hamstring tendinopathies, so a proximal hamstring tendinopathy can really do well. I've seen a lot of PHT clients that say strengthening's initially helped me, but now it's just ineffective. And you ask them, they say, okay, so why this plateau in improvement? What has your progression's been like? And they've done body weight squats, they've done body weight bridges, or they may have increased the weights of their bridges, but only progressed to 5 to 10 kilos. And you say, well, you got that initial success because of the strength work, but you just haven't progressed it. Like the tendons want slow, heavy load, and you're just not fostering that. And so I get them doing, say, deadlifts, and once they can tolerate it, and once their back is strong, and once their legs are strong, start doing really slow, heavy stuff, and they start responding a lot better than what they had have done if they were just doing bodyweight exercises and thinking or believing that that is strength training. So the tendons will do the slow, heavy stuff. The other types of injuries, so like patellofemoral pain, will respond more to like just any sort of squats, lunges. It doesn't need to be slow and heavy stuff. You need to just find what progression of exercises elicits that acceptable level of pain and just progress from there. It doesn't need to be slow and heavy. Shin splints would be more along the definitely load modifications. Definitely have to do that because something within their running has sparked the shins or the that particular part of the bone to become irritated. But again, that's strengthening the calf muscles, the soleus muscle, and load modifications. So there are specific approaches to specific conditions, but all the principles, all the management principles and the strength principles are pretty much the same as what I discussed at the start. It's just load modification, finding that new adaptation zone, working within that adaptation zone and progressing back up to where it previously was, and then trying to exceed what it once was to be as resilient as possible. And when you're talking about, it just took one jump for your knee to flare up again, that signifies to me that it probably just wasn't resilient enough. Yes, you could go to pain-free return to sport, but any little shift, any little spark, any little spike in load sets it off again. How about next time we rehab it so that it is just indestructible? You can do so many single leg squats, single leg deadlifts, hopping, like all these sort of things, and be unshakable. You can train that component to be as resilient as possible. That's a good goal, because then we're going from rehab to like a prehab to like a let's make this as strong as possible to reduce the risk of an injury in the future.